My life in Chicago has always been a bit foreign to me. I grew up in a small town not far from Milwaukee, and big cities always seemed hectic and too noisy to me. But when Kelly and I got married 3 years ago and inherited a house from her aunt in the heart of Chicago, moving here seemed like a natural step. To be honest, I was glad for the change. Opportunities, new horizons, this was what I felt I needed, or at least I thought so. Kelly couldn't find a job at first, which made her very upset. She was always active, and sitting at home all day was clearly not part of her plans. She seemed lost, annoyed, and every time I came home from work I could see that disappointment in her eyes. But everything changed when she got the position of administrator in a small production studio. They filmed series for various streaming platforms, and although it was only a trial period, after a month Kelly was already officially employed on a permanent basis and even received a raise. I watched as she gradually returned to her old self, energetic, confident, always smiling. But along with that, something in our lives began to change. And not for the better. She came home late, most often after I went to bed. She said it was because of new projects, and of course I tried to understand how it works in her industry. But doubts appear when you start noticing little things. One day I was coming home from the store and saw Kelly outside our house. She was standing with a man I didn't recognize. Their conversation seemed very warm, too warm. I did not approach, choosing to watch from the side. They laughed and I saw her give him a light kiss on the cheek before he got into the car and drove off. She calmly walked into our house as if nothing had happened. When I asked her about the man that evening, she said without hesitation, "He's my boss, Brian. He gives me a ride home when we work late." Her answer seemed perfectly reasonable to me, but there was something wrong with her voice. It was something small, maybe a hint of nervousness that I had never heard before. But then I decided to ignore it. However, every day the feeling that something was wrong only grew. I didn't want to seem like a jealous or suspicious man, so I tried to ignore those feelings. But the more I distanced myself from these thoughts, the stronger they reminded me of myself. One day I came to her work to help with the Wi-Fi reset and noticed the atmosphere in the office. There was a strange mood there, as if everyone knew something that I didn't. It was suspicious, but again, I decided not to jump to conclusions. Things got a lot more interesting when one day I happened to see Kelly sitting on the sofa in the office talking to the same Brian. He was 10 years older than her, with strong features and a confidence that was immediately noticeable. I didn't go in, just looked at them briefly, watching from afar. Maybe it was my imagination, but their conversation seemed too intimate for a normal professional relationship. That night I could not sleep for a long time. Thoughts swirled in my head that something was happening behind my back. Was it just my jealous fantasy, or was my wife really hiding something? Intuition, the same one that always saved me in difficult situations, screamed that it was necessary to act. The next morning I decided not to go to work and instead watch Kelly for a bit. She had the day off, but still said she would go to the office to help with a new project. I stayed at home and waited. After she left, I decided to look into her things, and that's when some interesting details started to emerge. That morning, when Kelly left for the office, I stayed at home, seemingly unsuspecting. I've always been someone who likes to plan and take action, so it took me a few hours to decide what to do next. Something told me I should check her stuff, but I always thought it was wrong to invade another person's personal space. However, my suspicions have long haunted me, and that day I decided to step over my moral barriers. I started with her bag lying on the chair by the bed. It contained the usual things: cosmetics, keys, a wallet, a notebook with work notes. Nothing suspicious, nothing that would indicate any betrayal. But then my attention was drawn to Kelly's phone, which was lying on the nightstand next to me. We never had secrets from each other, or so I thought, so we didn't put passwords on our phones. But today everything was different. I took her phone and noticed it was locked. Password. I don't remember Kelly ever putting a password on her phone. It was already something new, something that caused anxiety. My heart began to beat faster. I tried to remember all the possible combinations, but of course I couldn't unlock it without it. This feeling of restlessness only got worse. Why would she suddenly hide her phone from me? I began to think about our last few months together. She became more withdrawn, sometimes just silently looking at the screen, even when we were together. Something had clearly changed in our dynamic, but I couldn't pinpoint exactly when it started. Her phone was just one more detail in this kaleidoscope of doubts that formed in my head. I decided to proceed with caution. There was no point in asking her the question directly, because then she might just make up some plausible deniability. All her answers always seemed logical and reasoned. But now I was no longer sure that these were more than just well-thought-out excuses. Later that day I decided to take a walk to her office. I didn't want to arouse suspicion or look like a jealous man, so I chose a time when there are usually a lot of people walking past their building. I went up to the second floor where their office was located and pretended that I came to her by accident. Kelly was just leaving her office when she saw me. "Oh Ben, what are you doing here?" she asked in surprise, smiling. "Just passing by, thought why not stop by your place, maybe have lunch together." I tried to speak as casually as possible. Her smile looked genuine, but I noticed a subtle change in her expression as soon as she saw me. Something seemed to flash in her eyes, surprise or nervousness, perhaps. "Oh, I'd love to, but we have a lot of work today. Maybe later," she said, clutching some documents in her hands. I felt my suspicion grow stronger. Her tone was too calm and her words too thoughtful. That was the moment I realized that something was really suspicious. I decided to stay near the office without showing that I suspected anything. I said goodbye to Kelly and told her I was coming home. But instead, I sat down on the bench next to me and watched her office. My intuition told me that today could bring answers to my questions. After some time, a car drove up to the office. It was the same car I saw a few days ago when Kelly was parked outside our house with that man. I knew it was him, Brian, her boss. They left the office together and got into the car. I waited, hoping to see something more, but they just drove away. That evening I decided to take another step. At home, after Kelly got out of the shower, I tried to take her phone again while she was out of sight. But now I understand that this will not be enough. I decided to find something more substantial, something that could confirm or refute my suspicions. And that's when I remembered her work laptop. I knew she kept it at home in a drawer next to our bed. Kelly was always a little messy with paperwork and work stuff, and I was hoping there might be something important in there. When she fell asleep, I quietly took my laptop out of the drawer. My pulse jumped when I opened it and saw several messages on the screen that immediately caught my attention. These were letters between her and Brian. At first, they looked quite working, discussion of new projects, reports. But the more I read, the more personal they became. And here's one of them: "I think about you every day, even when you're not around. Our conversations are all I look forward to. I hope you get off early today so we can spend time together. Yours Brian." My hand trembled as I read those words. A wave of anger mixed with a sense of betrayal washed over me. I sat in the dark, reading these lines over and over, trying to figure out what it meant. My wife, is she really cheating on me with this man? I couldn't sleep all night, going over all the details of the past months in my head. That letter I read left an indelible mark on my mind. Brian's words echoed over and over in my mind like hammer blows on an anvil. Our conversations are all I look forward to. What exactly did he mean? And most importantly, what did this time they supposedly spent together mean? I felt like I couldn't sit still any longer. It was obvious that there was more going on between Kelly and her boss than just a working relationship. But how far did it go? I decided to find out everything to the end, but to do it so that she would not suspect anything. I had to find confirmation, evidence that could either dispel my suspicions or, on the contrary, make them even stronger. The next morning I left for her office, this time early so she wouldn't even suspect I was following her. I sat in a car nearby and waited. The hours passed slowly, but I finally saw her. Kelly left the office, but this time she was alone. This did not reassure me, on the contrary, it made the situation even more mysterious. She went to the car and I decided to follow her. At first, everything seemed normal. She went to several stores, bought groceries, but then suddenly stopped at an unfamiliar house on the outskirts of the city. It was a small house in an area where we usually never went. She got out of the car and I saw Kelly walk up to the door and ring the doorbell. To my surprise, Brian opened the door. He came out in relaxed clothes, clearly not at work. I leaned forward, straining my eyes to see better. They hugged. This was no longer an ordinary work date. I sat in the car, feeling my suspicions turn into cold, hard certainty. Something was going on between them, and it wasn't at all what Kelly was telling me about. But why did she come here? Why now? I waited outside the house, watching her go inside. It was a strange feeling, my heart pounding, but I knew I couldn't just barge in there and expose them. There was still too little evidence. I wanted to know more, to understand how far it had gone. Maybe it's just a random visit. Or maybe she came here because of work. Hours passed and Kelly was still in the house. My imagination conjured up worst-case scenarios, each worse than the last. But I decided to wait until she came out. When the door finally opened, it was already dark. Kelly looked relaxed, even happy. Brian walked her to the car, hugged her again, and she drove off. I saw it all with my own eyes, but what did it really mean? Maybe I bent the stick and just became a victim of my jealousy. Was there really something between them? I decided not to go home right away, but to pick up Brian. Maybe he will give me answers. I didn't know if I could talk to him directly, but I needed to know more. His car went to another area, but this time he did not go to his house. He went to one of the old bars in the city center that had a reputation for closed parties. What was he doing there? I decided to go inside, hoping not to attract too much attention. The place looked semi-dark, almost mysterious. I saw Brian sit down at a table with several people, including 2 other women. It all looked even more confusing than I expected. Maybe he's just having fun. But why did Kelly come to his house earlier? Even more mysteries. Nothing was clear. But I felt that I was on the threshold of something important. I continued to watch from the corner, hiding my presence, and waited for this puzzle to begin to come together. I sat in that bar watching Brian and my head was full of questions. He looked calm, relaxed, as if nothing special had happened. From time to time he joked with the women at the table, and this only strengthened my suspicions. I couldn't figure out how Kelly fit into that equation. Why was she at his house and he was somewhere else acting like it was a normal evening? It became more difficult to remain unnoticed. Several times I thought someone in his company glanced sideways in my direction, as if sensing my presence. But I tried to be as inconspicuous as possible. I knew deep down that this evening would bring me answers if I was patient. Suddenly, Brian got up from the table and headed for the exit, carefully leaning over one of the women and whispering something in her ear. She smiled back. It was the same woman who seemed especially close to him. It seemed that this was not just an ordinary party, these were people with whom he had a real connection. But I couldn't say which one yet. I decided to keep up with Brian. Something told me that this was not the end. He left the bar and headed toward the parking lot. I quietly followed him, trying to stay in the shadows. But what happened next only added fuel to the fire of my suspicions. In the parking lot, Brian was approached by a man I hadn't seen at the bar. They exchanged words briefly and I saw Brian handing him an envelope of some sort. It looked like a quick but important deal. The man quickly hid the envelope in his pocket and left. Brian was alone again, but now his face was no longer so serene. It was another mystery that only increased my curiosity. What was in that envelope? And why did this meeting take place so suddenly, without any previous signs? I decided I had to get home before Kelly suspected I was gone. My suspicions only grew, but now was not the time for confrontation. I didn't have enough evidence yet to confront her or Brian directly. More information, more facts were needed to reveal this game. When I got home, Kelly was already in our living room reading a book. She looked up at me and smiled as if everything was as usual. But now I couldn't look at her the same way. Her smile seemed fake to me, even if it was just my impression. "How's the day?" she casually asked, turning the page. "Fine," I answered, trying not to show my nervousness. My heart was pounding, but I did my best to stay calm. We spent the evening in silence. Her usual calm demeanor made me question everything I saw. Maybe I was too suspicious, maybe it was all just a figment of my mind. But then I remembered that letter, that hug outside Brian's house, and a new wave of suspicion washed over me. The next morning I decided to act more decisively. I couldn't sit back any longer. Kelly went back to work and I decided to use her laptop again, trying to find something new, something that might shed some light on what was going on between them. I turned on the computer and went through her emails. At first, everything looked like ordinary work correspondence. But a few minutes later I came across a new message from Brian. He invited her to another meeting, this time in a different place. This letter contained the name of a small hotel on the outskirts of town. Hotel? It looked too suspicious. Why are they meeting at a hotel if it's just a work relationship? I could feel the ground under my feet beginning to shake. Now it was already obvious that these were not just random work meetings. Something was happening between them. But what? My imagination was drawing the worst scenarios again. I decided that I could no longer just wait and watch. This time I had to see everything with my own eyes. I opened the browser on her laptop, hoping to find even more evidence. And what I found was a shock. She had a separate email that I never knew about. She kept this mail in secret, and that's where all the messages from Brian went. Each letter was even more intriguing than the last. In them, they talked not only about meetings at work, but also about personal things. These were plans that I could not even imagine before. I was sitting in a semi-dark room with my laptop on my lap and I could feel my heart pounding. Now I understood that the matter had gone much further than I could have imagined. But there were still so many questions. Why did she hide it? What really happens between them? The next meeting at the hotel was scheduled for tomorrow. And this time I had to be there. I had to find out the truth. The next day I woke up earlier than usual. Kelly was still asleep, her breathing even and calm. Looking at her, I tried to understand how she could hide secrets so easily. What made her do it? And what will I find today? I waited for her to wake up and go to work. She behaved as she always did, without a hint of anxiety or suspicion in her voice. If I didn't know what I know now, I might even consider this day to be normal. But everything inside me was burning with tension. Kelly said goodbye to me, gave me a small smile and went to work. I stayed at home for a few hours, pretending to do my own business, but I was actually waiting for the right moment to head to the hotel. I couldn't just sit at home. I understood that with every minute I was getting closer to something that would change my life forever. It remained only to find out exactly what this turn would be. When the time finally came, I took the car and went to the hotel that was mentioned in the letter. This place was located on the outskirts of the city, away from the noise of the center, and it seems that it was not chosen by chance. A small hotel, almost inconspicuous, with a cozy courtyard and several rooms. This was no place for ordinary business meetings. I parked on the street not far from the entrance and watched what was going on. After some time, a familiar car drove up to the hotel. It was Kelly. She got out of the car, looked around and confidently headed for the entrance. I held my breath as I watched her movements. There was no doubt, she did not come here for work matters. I waited a few minutes to make sure no one else would notice me and quietly followed her. My heart was beating so loudly that I could hardly hear my own footsteps. I stopped at the door where she had just entered and knocked on the door like a casual visitor who had lost her way. No one answered. I didn't know what to expect. Then I gathered my thoughts and decided to act. I found the hotel manager and told him that I had left my phone in the room I booked earlier. It was a risky move, but to my surprise, he didn't even doubt my words. The receptionist gave me the key and said it was a room on the second floor. Having climbed the stairs, I stood in front of the door that had just been opened for me. My hand shook as I held the key. It was a moment where I could open the door and destroy everything, or back off and leave it forever. But I have come too far to give up the truth. I slowly opened the door and looked inside. At first I didn't see anything suspicious. It was an ordinary hotel room, with a bed and a few pieces of furniture. But then I heard the sound of voices from the next room. They spoke quietly, but I could clearly recognize Kelly's voice. I couldn't believe that I was actually standing here, in this place, hiding behind the door, like an outside observer in my own life. Her voice was warm and soft, but now there was something in it that I had not heard before. She was talking to Brian about something, though I couldn't make out exactly what. But the tone of her voice gave away that this was not just a business meeting. It was an intimate moment, so obvious that I couldn't ignore it any longer. I tried not to give myself away, but my curiosity kept me going. I approached the door to the next room and quietly opened it. I was overcome with that feeling that happens when reality suddenly breaks. Kelly was sitting on the bed next to Brian. They were holding hands and talking about something that was clearly beyond the scope of normal conversation. It was like a blow to the heart. They didn't notice me right away, but my eyes had already seen enough. All the doubts I had before disappeared. It was not an innocent encounter. They clearly had more than just a friendly or professional relationship. My hand trembled on the doorknob, and suddenly Brian turned his head in my direction. He noticed me first. His eyes widened and he quickly pulled away from Kelly as if he'd seen a ghost. Kelly turned around as well, her expression instantly changing. Her previously calm mask disappeared, giving way to shock and anxiety. Ben. Her voice trembled, she clearly did not expect to see me here. I stood looking at them in silence, unable to utter a single word. Everything I saw spoke for itself. Their looks, their actions, every moment revealed what they were hiding from me. "What are you doing here?" she asked, although her question sounded silly. She knew very well that I understood everything now. I took a step back, unsure of what to say. Inside me, everything was spinning, raging, but the words did not find a way out. I could no longer believe that our story was what I imagined it to be. It was a betrayal hidden behind layers of deception, and now all its secrets have come to the surface. But that was not the whole story. I felt like there was something else I didn't know, another part of this game they were playing behind my back. And then I did the only thing I could in this situation. I just turned and walked away without saying another word. But it was only a pause. My next meeting with Kelly was to change everything. That I was walking down the corridor of the hotel, and a storm of emotions was raging inside me. My mind barely had time to process what I had just seen. I stepped outside, feeling the air chill my skin, but even that cold couldn't cool the anger and betrayal burning inside. Kelly. How could she? I got into the car, leaving the hotel behind, and tried to collect my thoughts. Now I knew that my intuition had not failed me. My suspicions were justified, but it did not bring me relief. On the contrary, the situation has become even more complicated. Everything I saw now demanded answers. But there was something about her expression when she saw me that made me wonder. It wasn't just fear that her secret was out. It was something else. Something deeper, hidden. I felt that she was afraid not only of my reaction, but also of what had happened before. Something about this situation was even more confusing and important. And I had to find out what exactly. When I got home, I didn't feel ready for the confrontation. I sat in silence, staring at the ceiling, trying to sort out my feelings. Part of me wanted to confront Kelly right away, expose her, force her to tell the truth. But another part knew that this was not the end. I had to be careful to find out more because it was obvious that the whole truth had yet to surface. Kelly returned home later that evening. Her steps were quiet and her face as neutral as ever. She entered the apartment, and our eyes met. I expected to see fear or nervousness, but her expression was subdued. She knew what I saw, but she hadn't made a move to start a conversation yet. "Hello," she said as calmly as if nothing had happened. But this calm annoyed me. My head was full of questions and I couldn't keep them inside anymore. "Kelly, do you have something to say?" I asked, trying to keep my composure, although everything inside me was boiling. She paused as if caught off guard, though it was obvious she suspected the question. Her eyes met mine for a moment, and I saw a hint of anxiety in them. But she quickly mastered herself. "I don't know what you're talking about," she replied quietly, and it was the worst she could say. These words provoked a new outburst of anger. She lied to my face, after I saw everything with my own eyes. And it just blew me away. "You don't know. Do you really think I'm stupid enough not to see what's going on? I was there today at the hotel. I saw you and Brian. What do you say now?" I raised my voice, not holding back my emotions. Her face contorted for a moment in surprise. She clearly didn't expect me to go this far. But even after I laid all my cards on the table, Kelly didn't break. Her expression changed, but not in the way I expected. Instead of being scared or apologetic, she looked exhausted. As if all this was already a burden for her. "Okay, Ben," she finally said, sitting down on the couch. "I think we should talk." I stood in the center of the room, still feeling the anger pulsing through me. But her tone silenced me. It wasn't the usual tone of excuses or defense. She spoke calmly, but at the same time seriously. She was ready to explain everything, but something told me that I would not like this explanation. "You're right," she said after a short pause. "I'm dating Brian. But it's not what you think." I remained silent, waiting for her to say next. Her words were at the limit of my tolerance, but I had to hear her to the end. "He and I aren't just in love, and it's not just cheating. There's something more that you don't know." She paused, looking at me. I felt a chill run down my spine. Her words sounded as if she was preparing for something terrible. Something that could completely shatter my world. "We've been planning this for a while, Ben. It's not just between me and him. Brian, he's not just in the production studio. His interests go way beyond that, and I was drawn into it. It started as casual flirting, but with sometimes everything changed. And now, I can't get out of it." I stood there in silence, trying to comprehend what she had just said. Her words echoed in my head, but I could not understand their meaning. She meant more than just a relationship with Brian. But what exactly? What kind of deal was she involved in? "What are you talking about? What does this have to do with your meetings with him?" I asked, hoping to get at least some clarity. Kelly looked at me seriously, as if trying to find the right words. Her voice was quiet but determined. "Ben, you don't know everything. Brian has connections with people who are doing much more serious things than production. And I happen to be a part of this game. It wasn't my choice, but now I can't stop it. And I don't know how to get out of there." These words were a shock. I was no longer sure that the reality I had been living in for the past few days was even true. What she described sounded like something from a movie, not from our lives. But her eyes, her tone were so serious that I couldn't just brush her words off. "What do you mean? Who are these people?" I asked, feeling that a secret was about to be revealed to me, which I did not even suspect. She took a deep breath before answering. "You'll see them sooner than you think. And then you'll understand why it all happened." Kelly's words stuck in my head like a bell that wouldn't stop ringing. "You'll see them sooner than you think. Who are these people? And why did she speak of them as if they were some kind of shadow that approaches but remains invisible?" At that moment, an oppressive silence reigned in our apartment. Kelly didn't explain anything else. Her eyes were empty, as if she had accepted some reality that was incomprehensible to me. I couldn't figure it out, but my intuition told me that it wasn't just flirting or cheating. What I had seen between her and Brian now seemed like only the tip of the iceberg. Something deeper, darker lurked beneath the surface. The next few days passed in a strange semi-light. Kelly acted as if nothing had happened. She offered no further explanation, but neither did she deny what had happened between us. All this time I was trapped in my own thoughts, trying to connect all the pieces of this torn puzzle together. Every night when Kelly came home, I felt like every step she took was part of some invisible game. She no longer looked guilty or scared, but instead looked like she was waiting for something. Maybe even on me. She wasn't afraid of what I knew, and that scared me the most. One day I decided to act. I couldn't stand the wait any longer. If there were any secrets, I had to reveal them. My first thought was of Brian. He became the central figure of this puzzle, and I had to learn more about him. What are these people with whom he was connected? And what is Kelly's role in this whole story? I started my own investigation. My first step was to search the internet for information about Brian. At first glance, his profile looked absolutely normal, a successful professional in the media business, several large projects related to the production studio. But something in his career seemed strange. Brian started in the production business just a few years ago and has been incredibly successful in that time. It looked as if he appeared out of nowhere. I decided to dig deeper. After a while, I managed to find some strange records that indicated that his name was associated with some suspicious business deals. They weren't obvious, but if you looked carefully, you could see that these deals appeared right when he started working in the production studio. The more I read, the more I felt that this whole thing smacked of something much more than just a relationship on the side. I remembered Kelly talking about how she couldn't get out of this game. But what kind of game was it? At this point I couldn't wait any longer. I decided it was time to meet Brian in person. He was the key to it all and only he could give me the answers I was looking for. I knew where he worked, so I decided to go to the production studio and try to talk to him. When I got there, it was already dark outside. The studio building looked abandoned, but there was life inside, light, shadows moving outside the windows. I entered the building confident in my intentions. Once inside, I walked past the empty reception desk and headed down the hallway where the offices were located. The hallway was quiet, but I could hear muffled voices from the office at the end. When I got to the door, I heard voices. It was Brian and a few other people I didn't recognize. They were talking about something that seemed very important. I leaned closer, trying to hear more, and then I realized that this wasn't just any ordinary conversation. "If the deal falls through, everything will be lost," one of the men said. His voice was strained. "We can't afford to make a mistake," Brian added. "Everything is on the edge." I could feel a cold sweat running down my back. It wasn't just some conversation about business or projects. There is something bigger, something more dangerous. I was standing in the shadows, trying to understand what was going on, when suddenly the door opened. Brian was standing in front of me. His eyes widened when he saw me, but he quickly returned to his usual cocky expression. "Ben." What are you doing here? He looked surprised, but his tone was cold. We need to talk, I replied, trying not to show my nervousness. Brian sighed and motioned for me to enter the room. I found myself inside with him and two other men who immediately took notice of me. Well, talk, said Brian, sitting down at the table. His gaze was impenetrable, and I knew that this was not going to be an easy conversation. What does it all mean? I began. Kelly, deals, these people. What's going on? Brian looked at me, his face cold and calm. He was silent for a few seconds before answering. You've gotten involved in something you'd rather not know about, he said, his words sounding like a threat. Kelly made her choice and now you're in the game too whether you like it or not. I felt the air thicken. It was a trap, and I knew that Brian wasn't going to just open all his cards to me. My head was in a fog when Brian said these words, you've gotten yourself into something you'd rather not know about. Everything I'd heard up to that point sounded like part of some game I didn't want to play. But now I was in the middle of this game and there was no way out. I sat across from Brian, feeling the tension in the room build with each passing second. The two other men who were here watched me silently, as if gauging how far I was willing to go. Their presence made me feel like it was more than just talking about Kelly. It was a game with rules I didn't understand but had to follow. What game is this, Brian? I tried to keep my voice even, but the tension in my body was growing. Kelly said she can't get out of it. What does that mean? Brian looked at me with a faint smile, but his eyes remained cold. She told you more than I expected, he said quietly, not directly answering my question. But if you want to know the truth, Ben, you have to be prepared for the consequences. Consequences? I leaned forward, not believing my ears. I've seen enough, Brian. You and Kelly, your betrayal. And now you're talking about some game. What is this business? What's going on? Brian sighed and looked at the two men who continued to watch us in silence. He gave a short nod, and they imperceptibly left the room, leaving us alone. What you saw between me and Kelly is only part of what's really going on, he finally said. His voice was quiet, but now a new tone appeared in it, a tone of sincerity. We're really together, but it's not what you think. We're involved in something more serious. It's not just an affair. Then what is it? I almost shouted. I have no patience left to listen to these half-wits. Brian gave me a long, hard look, then finally decided to speak frankly. Ben, Kelly and I have become part of a big project that started a few years ago. What the studio is doing is just a front. We're actually working on financial schemes that involve big players in the market. All these deals you're talking about, must have learned, have a deeper meaning. And Kelly, she happened to be a part of it. I listened to him, but my heart was pounding. What did it all mean? Financial schemes? A big project? The whole thing looked like something out of a crime movie and I found it hard to believe that my wife was involved. But what does that have to do with me? Why did you drag me in? I asked, feeling my pulse jump from fear. You weren't part of the plan, Ben, Brian replied. But now you've become a threat. You know too much and we can't afford you to tell anyone. His words were like a blow. I suddenly realized that this was not just a conversation. It was a threat. And now I found myself in a trap that I could not have foreseen. I felt my heart sink as I realized that this was far more serious than I had imagined. What do you mean by threat? I asked quietly, trying to hide my panic. Brian leaned forward and looked me straight in the eye. If you try to interfere with our plans or tell anyone about this, the consequences will be severe for you. I don't want that, Ben. But you have to understand that this has already gone beyond a personal relationship. I felt a cold sweat run down my back. He didn't say it directly, but I realized that my safety was now in jeopardy. I had become part of a game I had not chosen, and now I couldn't stop. You can't just drag me into this, I said, trying to collect my thoughts. I want nothing to do with it. I understand, Brian answered calmly. But you don't have a choice anymore. If you want to stay safe, stay out of this case. I know you want to find out the truth, but it's not the truth you want to know. My hands were shaking from the tension. I didn't know who to believe anymore. Kelly is in it so deep she can't even get out. But now I too was trapped. And now it became clear, this is no longer a matter of betrayal or personal revenge. It was a matter of survival. I stood up and looked at Brian, trying my best to look confident, even though everything inside me was screaming. I won't let you ruin my life, I said firmly. You and Kelly, you made your choice, but I'll find a way out. Brian smiled faintly. Good luck, Ben, he said quietly. But remember, you've already made your move. And now the game is on. I walked out of the studio feeling the ground shake under my feet. I could no longer think of it as simple betrayal. It was a struggle for survival. And I knew one thing, to get out of this trap, I would have to act faster than they thought. The next step was up to me. When I left the production studio, the feeling of unreality of the events that were taking place did not leave me. Everything I believed to be true about my life was shattered in an instant. Kelly, Brian, these mysterious people. They were all part of something bigger, something darker, and now I myself became part of this dangerous game. I sat in the car and began to consider my next move. My mind was going through all the possible options, but at that moment it was difficult for me to understand from which side to start unfolding this knot. One thing was clear, I can no longer act on my own. The game had become too dangerous and now I couldn't trust either Kelly or Brian. I returned home late at night. Kelly was at home, sitting at the kitchen table, silently looking at her phone. She didn't even look up when I entered. We had an unspoken understanding, no one asked questions. She knew I had already seen enough and must have sensed that a storm was about to break. But now we were both silent, as if that might stave off the inevitable. Thousands of questions swirled in my head, but I decided to give myself time. As much as I wanted to ask her about everything right away, I understood that she would not tell the truth. Her words last night about how she couldn't get out of this echoed in my head. Kelly was no longer the woman I married. Maybe I didn't even know her for real. The next day I woke up early. Kelly was no longer at home. She went to work, and I knew this was an opportunity to act. I had a few hours to try to find at least some clue. Now I needed to learn more about these financial schemes, about the people behind Brian. If Kelly was involved in something illegal, I had to find the evidence and understand how serious it was. I began by carefully checking her laptop, looking for traces of any suspicious correspondence or files. I had already seen those secret letters with Brian, but that was only the tip of the iceberg. And suddenly I came across a document that, at first glance, seemed like an ordinary financial report. However, while browsing, I noticed strange fund transfers made to offshore accounts. The funds went through several shell companies, and as I understood, these accounts were connected to the same production studio. My blood ran cold as I realized the magnitude of what was happening. It's not just a betrayal or a love triangle. It was a deeply hidden financial scam that went much further than I imagined. Millions of dollars passed through shadow accounts, and Kelly was involved. The more I looked, the more I began to understand that Kelly wasn't just a random participant in this. She played an important role. In her correspondence with Brian, there were several references to completion of the project that previously seemed insignificant to me. But now that I saw the financial statements, it started to make new sense. They were gearing up for something big, and Kelly was a big piece of the puzzle. I couldn't wait any longer. It was clear that something was brewing and I needed to know more about it as soon as possible. I decided that my next step would be to meet someone I didn't expect to be attracted to. It was late when I decided to take this step. I picked up the phone and called my old friend Jack. He worked in law enforcement, and even though we hadn't seen each other in a few years, I knew he could be trusted. We met in a quiet bar where I was able to calmly tell him everything I had learned. Jack sat listening intently, and I could see the same anxiety on his face that I felt myself. When I finished, he leaned forward and said quietly, "Ben, you have stepped into something very dangerous. If these financial schemes are as large as you say, then this could be part of a larger scam, possibly an international one. You did the right thing by coming to me, but this could have serious consequences. What should I do?" I asked, feeling the fear return again. "First of all, don't make any sudden movements," answered Jack. "If Kelly is really involved, we need to know more about their plans. You said they're up to something big. We need to figure out what exactly. But be careful, Ben. People involved in things like this don't usually forgive mistakes." I felt cold all over my body. Now I realized that the matter had become even more serious. Jack had promised to help me, but now it was clear that this was only the beginning. Ahead was a dangerous game that I was in against my will, but now I had to find a way to survive it. The next day I ran into Kelly again. She was sitting in the kitchen, as usual, but this time I looked at her differently. My wife was not just the person I used to know. She was part of a huge machine that destroyed everything in its path. But I decided not to reveal my cards just yet. The game has just begun. "How are you?" she asked, not looking at me. "It's normal," I answered, holding back all my emotions. She nodded curtly and went about her business. But now I knew what had to happen next. I needed to study her every move and find out the truth before she and Brian carried out their plan. I will meet Jack again tomorrow. And this time we will know more. But time played against us. The next day I woke up with the heavy feeling that every minute was now worth its weight in gold. Kelly was acting as calm as she had been yesterday, which only increased my suspicions. She dressed for work, smiled, even kissed me on the cheek before leaving, like everything was fine. But I have already seen through this mask. Beneath this outer shell lay a secret that I was to uncover. The meeting with Jack that day was short but intense. He began to proceed cautiously, working on his level to learn more about Brian and his connections. We agreed on the next steps, and I realized that the game was getting even more dangerous now. If Brian finds out we're trying to get to the truth, it could end badly. After meeting Jack, I decided to act immediately. I had to find more evidence, and that meant I had to risk another look into Kelly's life. I knew she had gone to work, so I decided to take advantage of her absence. The decision was not easy, but I had no other choice. I took her laptop again. I found strange financial documents before, but this time I decided to go even further. I found a hidden archive that I didn't even know about before. It was well password protected, but I managed to get around it after a few tries. What I found shocked me. Numerous files with documents opened before me, which indicated a whole network of companies connected with the production studio. It wasn't just a front for financial fraud, it was a whole business on the black market. All these schemes involved money laundering through fictitious projects, the sale of illegal goods and even the financing of dangerous groups. I sat in silence, feeling the cold run through my body. It wasn't just an affair or personal betrayal. This was a serious international criminal scheme and Kelly was deeply involved in it. It was hard for me to imagine that my wife could be a part of something so dangerous, but now it was obvious. She didn't just jump into it, she was involved from the start. I made copies of all these documents and decided that now was the time to act even more actively. I couldn't sit still any longer. My first thought was that I should get these materials to Jack immediately so he could start working on the case officially. But something held me back. It was a feeling that I didn't understand everything yet, that there was something that had escaped my attention. That night, when Kelly got home, I tried to hold myself together. We sat in the kitchen and I watched her, trying to see if there was anything suspicious about her behavior. But she remained the same as always, restrained, calm, as if nothing was happening. I couldn't stand this uncertainty anymore. I decided it was time to talk. This time I wasn't going to wait for her to tell the truth. I was going to force her. "Kelly, we need to talk," I said, trying to keep my voice level. She looked at me and saw that this time I was serious. "About what exactly?" Her voice was calm, but I could see that she knew where this conversation was going. "About all of this." I pulled out of my pocket some laptop printouts I had made earlier. Her eyes widened slightly, but she quickly regained control. "What is it, Ben?" she asked, but there was already a hint of anxiety in her voice. "You know exactly what it is. I know about the financial schemes and about Brian and what you're doing through the production studio. It's not just a job, it's much more. And now I know you've been in it from the beginning." Kelly was silent. Her face was a mask, but I could see that everything was boiling inside her. "You don't understand, Ben," she finally said. Her voice was quiet, but there was something vague about it, perhaps sadness or even despair. "Then explain." I wasn't going to back down. "I want to know everything." She took a deep breath and looked at me with a look I had never seen in her eyes before. It was the look of a man who could no longer hide the truth. "You should know I didn't choose this," she began. "I just wanted to get away from my routine life. Brian offered me an opportunity and I decided to give it a try. But over time I realized that it wasn't just a job. He got me into these schemes and now I can't get out. I'm in too deep. Why didn't you tell me earlier?" I asked, although deep down I knew the answer. "Because it could destroy us," she answered quietly. "And now, Ben, you're in on this too. If you go against them, it won't end well for either of us." These words hit me like a hammer blow. She wasn't just talking about business or relationships. She was talking about something much scarier. I realized that now my life is also in danger. And the only way out is to find out who is behind all this. "Who are they?" I asked, feeling my heart pounding in my chest. Kelly was silent for a moment, then looked directly at me. "You'll find out," she said quietly. "They'll come for you sooner than you think." My heart sank with fear. I realized that the game had taken on a new level of danger. Kelly's words, "They'll be coming for you sooner than you think," echoed in my head like alarm bells. It was now clear that the game was far more dangerous than I had imagined. I was overcome with fear, but at the same time a new feeling appeared: struggle. I couldn't sit back anymore. If someone really planned to come after me, I had to be ready. Kelly seemed calm that evening. Perhaps she thought that I would not do anything now, that I had submitted to the circumstances. But I already had a plan in my head. Jack helped me in the beginning, but now I realized that his resources may be limited. I decided to take one more step, a step that could be dangerous, but without it there was no chance of survival. I took the next day off from work. Outwardly, everything seemed as usual, an ordinary day, but I had a feeling that it would be decisive. I arranged to meet Jack in a safer place. We decided to meet in the park, away from prying eyes. I arrived early and sat on a bench waiting for Jack. My heart was pounding with nervousness, but I tried to control myself. Everyone who passed by seemed suspicious to me. I questioned even ordinary passers-by. It was the effect of the game I was drawn into. You begin to doubt everyone and everything. Jack appeared a few minutes later, calm and focused. He wasn't dressed in his normal work clothes, but more like someone trying to stay inconspicuous. We did not waste time on formalities. "I found something," he began, sitting down next to him. "You were right about Brian. His connections go much deeper. It's not just money laundering or financial schemes. There's an international crime group behind all of this. And they work through different companies in several countries." "What kind of group is this?" I asked, feeling how everything inside was tightening from anxiety. "We found several references to an organization called The Circle. They specialize in illegal financial transactions, arms trade, and other prohibited goods. They hide carefully behind a number of shell companies, and the production studio that Kelly works for is one of such companies. These words hit me like a cold shower. Now everything became clear. I found myself in a game where the stakes were much higher than I imagined. Circle. This name sounded like a sentence. Kelly was involved in something that threatened not only the two of us, but possibly many others. What now? I asked, trying to keep my voice calm. Jack looked at me seriously. Now we have to act fast. If you've gathered enough evidence, we can turn it over to the authorities. But you have to understand, once we do, there's no going back. They might react harshly. And Kelly. She might come under fire just like you. My heart sank. No matter what she did, she was still my wife. A part of me still had warm feelings for her despite the betrayal and deception. But now it became obvious, her life was in danger as well as mine. If I hand these materials over to you, what happens next? I asked, feeling the weight of this decision weighing on me. We will organize an operation. It will be difficult, but if everything goes according to plan, we will be able to stop the circle and bring them to justice. But this will require concrete evidence and time. I listened to Jack in silence, realizing that I had no choice. If I stop now, it could be a fatal mistake. But acting meant risking everything. Including the life of Kelly, who, after all, was already part of this game. Okay, I finally said. I have copies of the documents. We can start there. Jack nodded and we exchanged the necessary files. My way back home was like a fog. Now I couldn't just go back to my normal life. Everything has changed. I knew that if this plan worked, it would be the end of the circle, but it could also be the end of Kelly and I. But I couldn't control it anymore. When I got home, Kelly was already waiting for me. She stood by the window, silently looking out. As I entered, she turned and I saw an expression on her face that scared me. It was the look of a person who knew that nothing could be changed. "You did go see someone, didn't you?" she asked quietly. Her voice was calm, but I sensed something deeper in it, as if she already knew about my actions. "Yes," I answered, not hiding the truth. "Now that's about to change, Kelly. You're involved in something terrible, but we can still fix it." She was silent for a moment, then looked at me with her hard gaze. "You don't understand," she said quietly. "It can't be fixed. They already know. And now I'm not the only one in danger. You are too." Her words hit me like a knife. I felt a cold sweat run down my body. She didn't just say that. She knew something was already happening. "What are you talking about?" I asked, feeling anxious. "Brian knows about your actions," she said, then took a step forward. "They've already come for you. And now all we have to do is try to survive." My heart pounded in my chest as I realized that the game had already begun and I couldn't stop it. After Kelly's words, there was an oppressive silence in the room. My mind still refused to believe what was happening. All the puzzles now fit into a picture that I was afraid to see to the end. Kelly knew we could no longer control the situation. They have already come for me. But who are they? And how far did it go? I moved closer to Kelly, trying to understand what she meant. "How did they know?" I asked, but inside I already felt that the answer would be terrible. "They've been watching us for a long time," she answered quietly, looking down. "Our every move is under control. There's nothing I can do, Ben. As soon as you started digging, they already knew." My head was spinning from these words. This meant that all our conversations, meetings with Jack, all this was under their supervision. I understood that now I have no time. I had to act fast if I wanted to survive. What are they planning? I started walking around the room, trying to collect my thoughts. What will they do? Kelly looked up at me, and I saw something in her eyes that stopped me in my tracks: fear, real, unmitigated fear. "I don't know for sure," she answered, wringing her hands. "But I do know one thing: they don't leave a trail. If they decide to take someone out, it's only a matter of time. You have to run." "Escape?" I raised my eyebrows in surprise. "And leave it all? What about you, Kelly? What about our lives?" She got up from her seat and came to me, putting her hand on my shoulder. "Ben, our lives haven't been the same for a long time. You don't understand how serious this is. I dragged you into this and now you're in danger just like me." Her words hurt me. She was no longer playing the role of the victim or the confused woman. She was a part of this world, and now she understood that we were both consumed by this darkness. My heart pounded as I finally realized the extent of the threat. We were cornered. And the only way out was to run away. But was it a way out? Was it really possible to escape from people like Krug? "I need to contact Jack," I said, trying to stay calm. "We can still do something." Kelly nodded silently, but her eyes remained filled with worry. She no longer believed that we would be able to get out of this without loss. I dialed Jack's number. The line rang for a long time, but no one answered. Something was wrong. I typed again, same result. It wasn't until the third attempt that I realized it was a bad sign. "Jack isn't answering," I said, feeling a chill run through my veins. Something happened. Kelly looked at me, her eyes filled with desperation. They could already get to him. I was silent, trying to digest these words. Jack, who was the only person who could help, could now also be a target. They removed those who were in their way, and now it was our turn. Kelly walked over to the window, looked out, and then turned to me. "You have to go right now. If you stay, they'll find you." I could feel the fear beginning to take hold of me, but with it, the will to fight grew within me. I couldn't just run away and leave it all behind. "We'll run away together," I said, approaching her. "We'll find a way, Kelly. But we need to act now." We quickly started packing. Time was short, and I felt that every minute counted. I didn't know how far these people could go, but I was sure that if we stayed here a little longer, it might be too late. While Kelly gathered the essentials, I opened the safe that held our documents and some cash. We had to leave without a trace to complicate the search. I didn't know where we were going, but one thing was clear: staying here meant death. As soon as we packed up, I heard the sound of a car approaching our house. My heart pounded in my chest, and I cautiously approached the window. A black car was parked near our entrance, and two men in dark clothes got out of it. They were clearly not bystanders. "Kelly," I whispered. "They're already here." She froze in place, her face turned white. I could see her panic, but she quickly pulled herself together. "We have to go out through the back door," she whispered, pointing to a door at the end of the corridor. I nodded and we quietly moved in that direction, trying not to give myself away. We walked out the back door and I felt adrenaline rush through my body. We ran to the car parked nearby. As soon as we got inside, I started the engine and off we went. The house, our former life and everything we had were left behind. But there was only uncertainty and fear ahead. I didn't know how long we could hide. But now we are at a new stage of this game. And everything depended on whether we could survive in it. The next stop was far from the city that we drove in silence, leaving our whole lives behind. Kelly sat beside her, her hands clasped together, her gaze focused on the road ahead. I tried to control myself, but everything was boiling inside me. We've escaped, but how far can we escape? And what awaits us ahead? Every turn seemed like a trap. Every oncoming car caused alarm. I kept looking in the rearview mirror to make sure we weren't being followed. Those two near our house, who are they? What were they planning to do? And was this really the last attempt of the circle to reach us? We drove for several hours until we reached a small town several hundred miles from our home. It was a quiet place, away from major roads and noise. I chose it on purpose. I needed a place where we could hide for a while I figured out what to do next. When we pulled into the old motel where we planned to spend the night, Kelly was still silent. I could see that she was haunted by the same thoughts that I was. How did we get here? How did our life, which seemed so normal, turn into this nightmare? We took the room keys and went up to a small room. The motel was old but clean, and it was all we needed right now. I locked the door and finally sat on the bed, feeling the tension of the last few hours begin to release. "Kelly," I said quietly, looking at her. "We can't go on like this. This is not life." She went to the window and looked out. Her shoulders were shaking and I could see she was struggling to gather her thoughts. "I know," she finally answered without turning her head. "I understand what I've done. And now we're both trapped." I got up and walked over to her, placing my hand on her shoulder. She shuddered slightly, but did not move away. "We have to find a way out," I continued. "It might not be easy, but I won't let them control us anymore." Kelly turned to me and I saw tears on her face. She no longer tried to hide her guilt or fear. Now she stood before me as she really was, a person lost in a world that was alien to her. "I don't know how to get out of this, Ben," she whispered, broken. "This has gone too far." I hugged her, holding her close. Despite everything that happened between us, she was my wife. She had made a mistake, a big mistake, but now we both faced the unknown. And now we had to go out together. My decision was clear. I couldn't hide anymore. It will not save us. We needed to act, find a way to stop the circle and take back control of our lives. I knew it would be risky, but there was no other option. The next morning I decided to contact Jack again, hoping he was still alive. I called from the local phone at the motel, trying to be careful not to leave a trace. No one answered, which only confirmed my worst fears. We couldn't wait any longer. I picked up the phone and made one last call, this time directly to the feds. I knew it was a risk, but it was the only chance to stop this endless nightmare. I told everything I knew, provided the documents we collected. Everything was ready to expose the circle. For the next few days we lived in constant fear, expecting to be found at any moment. But one morning, instead of a doorbell, we heard the news on the radio. The FBI launched a large-scale operation to eliminate an international criminal network associated with illegal financial schemes, arms trafficking and money laundering. Brian and other key figures were arrested. I sat down in my chair and finally felt some relief. We did it. We survived. But I knew that now everything would be different. Kelly and I sat in silence, looking at each other. Our relationship was forever changed and I wasn't sure it could ever recover from everything that had happened. But now we had a future, and that was the main thing. We left the city after a few days. Now no one was chasing us, but we decided to start a new life somewhere far away, where no one knows us. Time should have healed our wounds, but I will never forget the game we were drawn into. It was a game of survival and we won it. But they lost a part of themselves along the way. Now there was a new path ahead.